Welcome to Café Stories. I'm Alfie, your host for today's mystery. We're joining the remarkable Miss Marple today in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead with the Larkspur Lane larcenies. Before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from today. Let me know in the comments. Settle in with a warm cup of tea, stay curious, and let's ease into this tale of garden thefts, rare orchids, and murder. The Greenhouse Strangler. Chapter 1. Tea and Troubles. It was a particularly fine Tuesday afternoon in May when Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall for tea with her friend Mrs. Bantry. The rhododendrons were in magnificent bloom, their vibrant colours making a striking display against the old grey stone of the house. Miss Marple, neat in her tweed costume, carrying her knitting bag, advanced up the path with a light step that belied her age. Mrs. Bantry greeted her with enthusiasm. "Jane, how delightful! You're just in time. Mrs. Pringle and Miss Weatherby have arrived only moments ago." Miss Marple smiled. She had expected a quiet tete-a-tete with Dolly Bantry, but was not displeased. Village news was always illuminating, and Mrs. Pringle, wife of the solicitor, was generally well informed. "I've set tea in the drawing-room," continued Mrs. Bantry, leading the way. "It's such a lovely day, but Mrs. Pringle was complaining of a draught." The drawing-room at Gossington Hall presented its usual comfortable appearance. Miss Weatherby, a thin, nervous lady who taught piano to the village children, was seated on the sofa while Mrs. Pringle occupied what had always been considered her chair near the fireplace. "Miss Marple, how fortuitous!" exclaimed Mrs. Pringle. "We were just discussing the most extraordinary occurrences on Larkspur Lane." Miss Marple seated herself carefully. "Indeed?" she inquired, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry. "I don't believe I've heard anything unusual." "You haven't heard?" Miss Weatherby's voice rose slightly. "It's been nothing but thefts and mischief this past fortnight. Most disturbing indeed." "First it was my silver tea service," said Mrs. Pringle. "Not the entire set, mind you, just the sugar bowl and creamer. Most peculiar." "And then poor Mrs. Fortescue's brooch," added Miss Weatherby. "Victorian," she said, "a family piece with garnets." Mrs. Bantry, pouring tea, nodded gravely. "Yes, and now Miss Weatherby has had a most unsettling experience. Do tell Miss Marple about Emerson." Miss Weatherby set down her cup with a slight rattle. "My Emerson, my cat, you understand, disappeared for 2 days. When he returned, his fur had been dyed a most unnatural shade of blue on his tail and paws. I can't imagine what kind of person would do such a thing." "Most extraordinary," murmured Miss Marple, reaching for a cucumber sandwich. "And these events all occurred on Larkspur Lane?" "All within the past 10 days, confirmed Mrs. Pringle. "Inspector Slack says it's that Cobb boy, Reggie. Always been a troublemaker, that one." Miss Marple's faded blue eyes showed a momentary twinkle. "Young Reggie? I recall he had some trouble with Mr. Blacker's apple trees last autumn." "Precisely," said Mrs. Pringle triumphantly. "A petty thief and miscreant. His poor mother doesn't know what to do with him." "He was seen skulking about Mrs. Hawkesworth's garden yesterday," offered Miss Weatherby. "Mrs. Hawkesworth herself told me so when I was returning from my piano lessons." At the mention of Mrs. Hawkesworth, a slight silence fell over the group. Mrs. Bantry, ever the attentive hostess, hastened to offer more tea. "Mrs. Hawkesworth is well, I trust?" asked Miss Marple. "I understand she is quite devoted to her greenhouse." "Orchids," said Mrs. Pringle, with a slight sniff. "She talks of nothing else these days. That and her nephew coming to stay." "Gerald Hawkesworth," supplied Mrs. Bantry. "I met him at the post office yesterday. Rather abrupt manner, I thought." "His late father's banking business keeps him in London, I believe," said Mrs. Pringle, "though one wonders what brings him to St. Mary Mead now. Mrs. Hawkesworth was never particularly close to her brother's family." "Perhaps it's the orchids," suggested Miss Weatherby with a nervous laugh. I understand she's developed some special variety. She's to present it at the Horticultural Society meeting next week. Mrs. Hawksworth is rather accomplished at hybridization, I believe, said Miss Marple mildly. You would know about that, Miss Marple, with your gardens always so lovely, said Mrs. Bantry. Oh, did I mention that Mr. Preston has joined the society? Quite the enthusiast, apparently. He was discussing propagation methods with Colonel Bantry most energetically at the vicarage fete. Mr. Preston from Mead Cottage? Inquired Miss Marple. The very same. Retired from India, I believe. He's taken the cottage for the season. Seems particularly interested in Mrs. Hawksworth's work. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She was about to speak when the door opened and Colonel Bantry appeared. "Forgive the interruption, ladies," he said. "I've just had a telephone call from the vicar. It seems there's been another incident on Larkspur Lane. Mrs. Thompson's garden ornaments have vanished. 3 ceramic toadstools and a rather ghastly gnome." "How perfectly absurd!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry. "Who would want such things?" "That Cobb boy, no doubt," said Mrs. Pringle firmly. "The curious thing," continued Colonel Bantry, "is that Mrs. Thompson also reported seeing someone in Mrs. Hawksworth's garden last night, someone with a torch, examining the greenhouse. She assumed it was Mrs. Hawksworth herself, but mentioned it to the vicar this morning." "Most peculiar," said Miss Weatherby, her hands fluttering. One doesn't like to think of prowlers," interrupted Mrs. Pringle. "Inspector Slack should speak to that Cobb boy immediately." Miss Marple had listened to the conversation with careful attention. Now she folded her hands in her lap and looked thoughtful. "It all seems rather theatrical, doesn't it?" she observed quietly. The others looked at her in surprise. "Theatrical, Miss Marple?" inquired Mrs. Bantry. "The nature of the thefts," explained Miss Marple. "A sugar bowl and creamer, but not the teapot. A brooch, a cat returned with dyed fur. Garden gnomes. It reminds me rather of something that happened in the village years ago when Mrs. Eldon's maid was putting on amateur dramatics." She did not elaborate further, and the conversation soon turned to other matters, the vicar's sermon, the shortage of good help, and the weather prospects for the upcoming garden party at the vicarage. But as Miss Marple later made her way home along the quiet village lanes, she couldn't help but reflect on the curious incidents at Larkspur Lane and the sense of something not quite right, a feeling that had served her well on previous occasions. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Garden. The following morning dawned bright and clear, ideal for gardening. Miss Marple, attired in her oldest tweed skirt and a serviceable cardigan, was on her knees tending to her roses. Her hands, thin and wrinkled but surprisingly dexterous, moved with practised efficiency as she pruned away dead growth. "The buff beauty needs tying back," she murmured to herself, "and the Dorothy Perkins is getting quite unruly." Gardening gave Miss Marple time to think, and this morning her thoughts were occupied with the curious events on Larkspur Lane. The seemingly pointless thefts troubled her. There was a pattern there, or rather a lack of pattern that in itself formed a pattern, that reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. The cheerful voice of her help, Cherry Baker, interrupted her reverie. "I've brought you out some tea, Miss Marple. You've been at those roses for nearly 2 hours." "Have I really? How good of you, Cherry." Miss Marple straightened carefully, brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "Any news from the village this morning?" Cherry set the tea tray on the garden table. "Well, Mrs. Elsie at the post office says there's been more trouble on Larkspur Lane. Someone's taken all the garden gnomes from the Thompson place, and—" she lowered her voice conspiratorially. "There's talk that young Reggie Cobb was seen near Mrs. Hawksworth's greenhouse again last night." "Indeed?" Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea. And has Reggie been questioned about these incidents? Inspector Slack had him in yesterday, from what my Ted heard down at the Blue Boar, but they couldn't prove anything. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Her cottage, situated on the edge of the village, afforded her a view of several neighbouring gardens. From where she sat, she could just glimpse the elaborate wrought-iron fence that surrounded Mrs. Hawksworth's property 2 doors down. As she sipped her tea, she noticed movement there, Mrs. Hawksworth herself, in earnest conversation with a younger man. Even from this distance, the conversation appeared heated. The man, who must be Gerald Hawksworth, the nephew, was gesticulating with a sheaf of papers, while Mrs. Hawksworth stood very straight, shaking her head emphatically. After a moment, she turned abruptly and walked back towards her house, leaving Gerald standing by the fence, his expression tight with frustration. "Families," murmured Miss Marple to herself, "so often the source of the deepest complications." Cherry, who had been gathering the pruning tools, looked up. "Beg pardon, miss?" "Nothing of importance, Cherry. I was merely reflecting on family dynamics." After Cherry had gone inside, Miss Marple resumed her gardening, though she found herself glancing occasionally towards Mrs. Hawksworth's property. She had known Arabella Hawksworth for many years, not intimately, for Mrs. Hawksworth kept largely to herself, but with the familiar acquaintance that develops in village life. A widow of considerable means, Mrs. Hawksworth had in recent years become increasingly devoted to her greenhouse and particularly to her orchids. Miss Marple was deadheading her delphiniums when she heard the garden gate open. Looking up, she saw the familiar figure of the vicar approaching down the path. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he called cheerfully. "What a splendid display of roses." "Good morning, Vicar. How kind of you to say so, though I fear the black spot has been troublesome this year." The vicar settled himself on the garden bench. "I was passing and thought I might stop by. There's been quite a bit of excitement in the parish lately." "You're referring to the thefts on Larkspur Lane, I presume?" "Precisely. Most peculiar incidents, and now I understand Mrs. Hawksworth has had some disturbance around her greenhouse." Miss Marple carefully placed a cut stem into her trug. "Nothing taken, I hope?" "No, nothing missing as far as she can tell, but she was quite agitated about it when I spoke with her after morning prayer. She's been working on a new orchid hybrid, quite valuable from what she says. She's to present it at the Horticultural Society meeting next week." "Yes, I had heard something of the sort," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Hawksworth has always been most accomplished with her orchids." "Indeed? Quite passionate about them?" "Between ourselves," the vicar lowered his voice slightly, "I gather there's been some tension with her nephew over her, horticultural expenditures. Young Mr. Hawksworth apparently feels his aunt's spending on her greenhouse is excessive." "How unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple. "Family disagreements are always distressing." "Quite so, but Mrs. Hawksworth was most emphatic that her newest hybrid would justify everything, something about patent rights and royalties. I'm afraid I didn't fully understand the technical aspects." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. The commercialization of specialized plant varieties can be quite complex, I believe. The vicar looked at her with mild surprise. "You seem well informed on the subject, Miss Marple." "Oh, merely general knowledge gleaned from gardening journals," she replied modestly. "One does pick up bits and pieces over the years." Their conversation drifted to parish matters, and shortly thereafter the vicar took his leave. Miss Marple returned to her gardening, but her mind was active beneath the brim of her faded straw hat. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village post office. Mrs. Elsie, who combined her postal duties with a flourishing trade in gossip, was serving Miss Weatherby when Miss Marple entered. "And I said to her," Mrs. Elsie was saying, "that young man has no business prowling around at night. If he's seen near Mrs. Hawksworth's greenhouse again, Inspector Slack should be informed immediately." "Quite right," agreed Miss Weatherby nervously, "especially after what happened to my poor Emerson. One shudders to think what might be taken next." Miss Marple browsed among the birthday cards as she waited her turn. By the window she noticed two women speaking in low voices, Mrs. Pringle and a stout, red-faced woman, whom Miss Marple recognized as Mrs. Hartley from the village shop. "Spotted him there again last night," Mrs. Hartley was saying, and not an hour later Mrs. Hawksworth was having words with Mr. Preston over the garden fence. "Mr. Preston?" responded Mrs. Pringle. "About what, I wonder?" "Something about breeding rights," Ted heard. "You know he does the gardens for Mr. Preston twice weekly." Very heated it was. Mrs. Hawksworth said something about registration papers and Mr. Preston looking altogether too interested in her greenhouse. Miss Marple selected a card with a watercolour of roses and moved to the counter. As Mrs. Elsie wrapped it in paper, Miss Marple inquired mildly about the weather forecast. "They say it's to be fine through Thursday," replied Mrs. Elsie, "though my rheumatism tells me different. Have you heard about the goings-on at Larkspur Lane, Miss Marple?" "I've heard various accounts," said Miss Marple, "most perplexing." Walking home with her purchase, Miss Marple reflected on what she had overheard. The matter of Mrs. Hawksworth's orchid hybrid, the nephew's displeasure, Mr. Preston's apparent interest. These fragments began to form a picture in her mind, though its outlines remained indistinct. She recalled a similar situation some years ago with Mrs. Beddoes and her prize dahlias, though that had merely resulted in wounded feelings rather than anything more sinister. As she turned onto her garden path, Miss Marple noticed a moving shadow beyond Mrs. Hawksworth's fence. Someone was in the garden, stooped over as if examining plants. For a moment she thought it might be Reggie Cobb, but the figure straightened, revealing itself to be Mr. Preston. He stood for a moment, making a note in a small book, then moved purposefully toward Mrs. Hawksworth's greenhouse. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as she watched him disappear inside. Chapter 3. Death Among the Orchids. The news broke at precisely 10:17 the following morning. Miss Marple was just placing a freshly baked Victoria sponge on the kitchen table when the telephone rang. Cherry answered it, and moments later appeared in the doorway, her young face unusually pale. "It's Mrs. Bantry, miss," she said, in a hushed voice. "She says there's been a murder at Mrs. Hawksworth's." Miss Marple received this intelligence with remarkable composure. "Thank you, Cherry," she said, taking the telephone receiver. "Dolly?" "Yes, I hear there's been some dreadful news." Mrs. Bantry's voice came through, high-pitched with excitement. "Jane, the most awful thing. Mrs. Hawksworth has been found dead, murdered, in her greenhouse, strangled. Mrs. Elsie just telephoned to tell Arthur. The whole village is in an uproar." "How distressing," said Miss Marple. "When was she found?" "This morning by her gardener, Hopkins. He arrived at 9 o'clock as usual and found her among her orchids. Apparently she's been dead since last night." "Jane, do you think... could it be connected to those strange thefts?" "It would seem rather a significant escalation," murmured Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Arthur says Inspector Slack is already convinced it's that Cobb boy. Apparently they found a footprint matching his boots near the greenhouse." "I see," said Miss Marple. There was a slight pause before she added, "Will you be calling on the household? One does like to express condolences in person." "I was thinking of going over this afternoon. Would you care to accompany me?" "That would be most suitable. Shall we say 3 o'clock? After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, her faded blue eyes thoughtful. Cherry, who had been hovering anxiously, spoke up. "Is it true then, miss?" "About poor Mrs. Hawksworth?" "I'm afraid so, Cherry." "They're saying it was that Reggie Cobb," ventured Cherry. Ted saw him running past the blue boar last night, looking all shifty-like." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, non-committally. By early afternoon, St. Mary Mead was in a state of barely suppressed excitement. Murder was, after all, a conversational resource of considerable value. As Miss Marple made her way to Gossington Hall to meet Mrs. Bantry, she noted several small clusters of villagers engaged in animated discussion. "Always knew that Cobb boy would come to no good," she overheard Mrs. Pringle saying outside the butcher's shop. "Taking a human life over a few garden ornaments, it doesn't bear thinking about." At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with nervous energy. "Jane, I've just had Colonel Melchett on the telephone. He's joined Inspector Slack at the scene. It seems they're quite certain it was Reggie Cobb. He's disappeared, you know." "Has he indeed?" murmured Miss Marple, straightening her gloves. "Ran off last night and hasn't been seen since. And now there's proof, a footprint by the greenhouse that matches those peculiar boots of his. And Hopkins says a pot was knocked over, a valuable orchid, apparently." The short drive to Larkspur Lane was punctuated by Mrs. Bantry's excited speculations. When they arrived at Mrs. Hawkesworth's substantial Victorian residence, they found a police constable stationed at the gate, but Mrs. Bantry's position in the village secured their admission to the house. The drawing-room presented an unusual scene. Inspector Slack, looking grim, was questioning a pale young man whom Miss Marple identified as Gerald Hawkesworth. Colonel Melchett stood by the fireplace, while a nervous-looking woman whom Miss Marple did not recognize sat stiffly on a chair by the window. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," said Colonel Melchett, nodding to them. "I'm afraid you've come at a difficult time." "We felt we should pay our respects," said Mrs. Bantry. "Such a shocking thing, poor Mrs. Hawkesworth." Inspector Slack looked up with barely concealed impatience. "If you ladies wouldn't mind waiting, we're in the middle of questioning Mr. Hawkesworth." Gerald Hawkesworth ran a hand through his hair. "As I've already explained, Inspector, I left my aunt at approximately 8:30 last evening. She was in perfectly good health and mentioned she was going to work in her greenhouse. We had—" He hesitated. "A minor disagreement over some family papers, but it was nothing significant." "And you went directly back to the Rose and Crown after that?" pressed Inspector Slack. "I did. You can confirm it with the landlord. I had a drink in the public bar and retired to my room before 10. "I see." Inspector Slack made a note. "And you were not aware of your aunt's valuable orchid hybrid or the papers relating to its patent?" A flash of something, surprise perhaps, or annoyance, crossed Gerald Hawkesworth's face. "I knew she was working on something she considered important, but the details of her horticultural pursuits didn't interest me particularly." The woman by the window cleared her throat. "Mrs. Hawkesworth was most secretive about her new hybrid, Inspector, even to me, and I've been her companion for 3 years. "Thank you, Miss Brewster," said Colonel Melchett. "Now, I understand Mrs. Hawkesworth was last seen alive by Hopkins, the gardener, when he left at 6 yesterday evening." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, ventured a gentle question. "Might I inquire if anything was taken from the greenhouse?" Inspector Slack looked at her with slight irritation. "That's police business, Miss Marple." "But surely it would help to establish a motive," persisted Miss Marple mildly. "For instance, were Mrs. Hawkesworth's orchid notes missing?" A slight look of surprise crossed Colonel Melchett's face. "As a matter of fact, they were." "How did you know about those?" "One does hear things in the village," said Miss Marple, vaguely. Mrs. Hawkesworth was known to keep meticulous records of her hybridization experiments. Gerald Hawkesworth frowned. "Are you suggesting someone murdered my aunt for her gardening notes?" "Orchid hybridization can be quite valuable commercially, I believe," said Miss Marple, "particularly if one can secure patent rights." Mrs. Bantry, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Jane, surely you don't think someone would commit murder over a flower?" "People have killed for far less, Dolly," replied Miss Marple quietly. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "We're working on the theory that the Cobb boy was caught stealing by Mrs. Hawkesworth and panicked. His boot print was found near the scene and he's been missing since last night." "I see," said Miss Marple. "Was there anything else unusual about the greenhouse? The arrangement of Mrs. Hawkesworth's possessions, perhaps?" Colonel Melchett gave her a curious look. "Her glasses were found on a potting bench, rather oddly placed, and the garden twine used to—" He glanced at Miss Brewster. "Well, it had been cut with unusual precision, not torn or frayed." "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple, almost as if someone familiar with gardening implements had used proper secateurs rather than tearing the twine in haste. Inspector Slack's expression hardened. "We'll be the judge of that, Miss Marple. Now, if you ladies don't mind, we have an investigation to conduct." As they were leaving, they encountered a harried police constable rushing up the garden path. "Inspector," he called, "we've had word of Reggie Cobb. He's been spotted near Danebridge, heading toward the old mill." Inspector Slack immediately barked orders for a search party. In the ensuing commotion, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry made their way back to the waiting car. "What do you make of it all, Jane?" asked Mrs. Bantry as they drove away. Miss Marple smoothed her gloves thoughtfully. "I find it most interesting that Mrs. Hawkesworth's orchid notes are missing, and that the murder weapon was cut so precisely." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden. Beyond the hydrangeas, she could just see the police activity continuing at Mrs. Hawkesworth's residence. She thought about the precisely cut garden twine, the missing notes, and the peculiarly placed spectacles. Somewhere in the gathering twilight, a manhunt was underway for young Reggie Cobb, while a killer's tracks were being obscured by the very investigation meant to reveal them. Chapter 4. The Reluctant Suspect. The apprehension of Reggie Cobb occurred in a manner that Miss Marple later described as most illuminating. 2 days after Mrs. Hawkesworth's body had been discovered, Reggie was caught in the act of purloining a packet of digestive biscuits from Mr. Patel's grocery shop. He made no attempt to flee, submitting to capture with a resignation that suggested relief rather than remorse. Miss Marple received this news from Cherry, who burst into the morning room where Miss Marple was arranging flowers. "They've caught him, Miss Marple, that Reggie Cobb, stealing biscuits from Mr. Patel's, bold as brass." "Indeed?" Miss Marple paused, a stem of larkspur balanced delicately between her fingers. How curious that he should risk capture for something so trivial. "Ted says he looks half-starved, been hiding in the old priory ruins since the night of the murder." Cherry lowered her voice on the last word, as though murder itself might appear if spoken of too loudly. "Poor boy," murmured Miss Marple. "He must have been quite desperate." "Poor boy?" Cherry's eyes widened. "But, Miss Marple, he's a murderer." "Is he?" Miss Marple placed the larkspur precisely in her arrangement. "We shall see." Later that morning, having completed her household tasks, Miss Marple donned her best hat and gloves and made her way to the police station. Constable Peters, stationed at the front desk, looked up in surprise. "Miss Marple, what can I do for you this morning?" "Good morning, Constable. I believe I may have dropped my handkerchief yesterday during my constitutional. I was passing quite near where young Reggie Cobb was apprehended, and I wondered if perhaps it had been found." Constable Peters looked doubtful. "No handkerchiefs have been handed in, Miss Marple, but I can make a note of it." "That's most kind. I don't suppose—" She hesitated. "I don't suppose I might inquire after young Reggie." Such a shocking business. One can't help but feel concerned for someone who grew up in the village, whatever his misdeeds. The constable's expression softened slightly. "He's being held for questioning about Mrs. Hawkesworth's murder. Inspector Slack is with him now." As if on cue, a door at the end of the corridor opened, and Inspector Slack emerged, his face set in lines of frustration. He stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, this is an official police investigation. What brings you here?" "A lost handkerchief, Inspector. Pure coincidence, I assure you." She smiled gently. "I gather you're interviewing young Reggie?" Inspector Slack's frown deepened. "We are. And despite what everyone in this wretched village seems to think, my job would be considerably easier without civilian interference." "Of course, Inspector." "Has Reggie confessed to Mrs. Hawkesworth's murder?" A muscle twitched in Inspector Slack's jaw. "He admits to the thefts, claims they were pranks, if you can believe it, but is denying any knowledge of the murder." "How interesting." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "And the evidence against him?" "Is substantial. Now, if you'll excuse me, Miss Marple." "Just one small matter, Inspector. I wonder if I might have a brief word with Reggie. His mother and I were acquainted through the Women's Institute, and I feel a certain responsibility—" "Absolutely not," interrupted Inspector Slack. "This is a murder investigation, not a social call." "Of course. But sometimes a familiar face. And I did bring him a few biscuits." She produced a small paper bag from her handbag. "Poor boy must be hungry after hiding in the Priory ruins." Inspector Slack looked as though he might refuse outright, but Constable Peters interjected. "Sir, we do need to get that statement from Mrs. Wilkins. Perhaps while you're doing that?" With evident reluctance, Inspector Slack agreed. 5 minutes, Miss Marple, and Constable Peters will be present throughout." The cell where Reggie Cobb was being held was small but clean. Reggie himself, a lanky youth with an unfortunate complexion and a perpetual slouch, sat on the narrow cot, looking up with surprise as Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple?" His voice cracked slightly. "They don't think you did it too, do they?" Despite the circumstances, Miss Marple couldn't help a small smile. "No, Reggie, I brought you some biscuits." She handed the paper bag to Constable Peters, who inspected it before passing it to Reggie. "Thank you," mumbled Reggie, taking a biscuit with trembling hands. "They all think I killed old Mrs. Hawkesworth, but I didn't. I wouldn't. I only took things for a laugh, like the silver sugar bowl and creamer, Mrs. Fortescue's brooch, Miss Weatherby's cat." Reggie nodded miserably. "And Mrs. Thompson's garden gnomes, but I never hurt anybody. I was going to put everything back. It was just—" He stopped, looking embarrassed. "Just a prank," Miss Marple finished for him. "Like the incident with Tommy Jenkins and the church silver?" Reggie's eyes widened. "You remember that? That was years ago, before the war even." "I remember a great many things, Reggie. Tell me, why did you run away the night Mrs. Hawkesworth died?" "I was going to nick something from her greenhouse," Reggie admitted. "But when I got near, I saw someone already there, inside with a torch. I thought it might be the police looking for me because of the other things, so I scarpered." "I see. And this person in the greenhouse, did you recognize them?" Reggie shook his head. "Too dark. Just saw the light moving around inside." "And at what time was this, approximately?" "Must have been close to 9. The church bells had just gone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Reggie. You've been most helpful." "Miss Marple," Reggie's voice was urgent now, "I didn't kill her. I wouldn't. You believe me, don't you?" Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Yes, Reggie, I believe you." Upon returning home, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and carefully made a list of the stolen items: a silver sugar bowl and creamer, but not the matching teapot, a Victorian brooch, a cat, returned with dyed fur, ceramic garden ornaments. She studied the list for several minutes, then added a note. All items either returned or of relatively little value, theatrical rather than practical. She remembered the Tommy Jenkins affair from years ago, how the boy had been suspected of stealing the church silver, only for it to emerge later that the true culprit was the verger's nephew, who had orchestrated a series of minor thefts to divert attention from his systematic embezzlement of church funds. "A distraction," murmured Miss Marple. "But a distraction from what?" She added another item to her list. Mrs. Hawkesworth's orchid notes missing. She recalled what the vicar had mentioned about Mrs. Hawkesworth's new hybrid being valuable, something about patent rights and royalties. And then there was Mr. Preston's unusual interest in the greenhouse and the strained relationship between Mrs. Hawkesworth and her nephew over her horticultural expenditures. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mrs. Bantry, full of excitement. "Jane, have you heard? They've charged Reggie Cobb with the theft of Mrs. Fortescue's brooch. But Inspector Slack isn't convinced he murdered Mrs. Hawkesworth after all. Apparently the boot print doesn't match perfectly, and Reggie insists he saw someone in the greenhouse that night." "How very interesting," said Miss Marple. "I had rather come to the same conclusion myself." After speaking with Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple returned to her list, adding one final note, precisely cut garden twine, secateurs, not haste. She sat back, her faded blue eyes thoughtful, as she contemplated the pattern emerging from these seemingly disconnected facts, a pattern that suggested the thefts on Larkspur Lane were indeed a distraction, but from something far more valuable than silver or brooches, something worth killing for. Chapter 5. Secrets and Specimens. The morning was unusually warm for May as Miss Marple made her way along Larkspur Lane. She had dressed with particular care in her second-best tweed suit and a hat that, while no longer fashionable, was still perfectly presentable. In her gloved hands she carried a small bouquet of flowers from her garden. The constable stationed outside Mrs. Hawkesworth's house recognized her from her previous visit with Mrs. Bantry. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said politely. "I'm afraid the family isn't receiving visitors at present." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple. "How disappointing. I had hoped to express my condolences in person. And," she added with a touch of wistfulness, "I had so looked forward to seeing poor Mrs. Hawkesworth's garden one last time. We often discussed our horticultural interests, you know. I brought these from my own garden as a small tribute." The constable hesitated, clearly torn between duty and courtesy. "Well, I suppose there's no harm in your leaving the flowers. Mr. Hawkesworth is out at the solicitor's, and Miss Brewster is resting. The garden should be quite empty." "How kind of you," beamed Miss Marple. "I shan't be long." Once past the wrought-iron gate, Miss Marple paused to survey the garden. It was extensive and meticulously maintained, with formal beds, a small rose garden, and at the far end the substantial greenhouse where Mrs. Hawkesworth had met her end. Police tape still cordoned off the greenhouse entrance. Miss Marple was carefully placing her modest bouquet at the base of a particularly fine rhododendron when a voice startled her. "Beautiful specimens, aren't they?" Mrs. Hawkesworth had quite the eye for quality plants. Miss Marple turned to find Mr. Preston standing a few feet away. He was a tall, spare man with the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His expression was appropriately solemn, though his eyes moved restlessly over the garden beds. "Mr. Preston, isn't it?" said Miss Marple. Yes, Mrs. Hawkesworth was renowned for her horticultural achievements. "I understand you share her interest in gardening." "Indeed." Preston moved closer, extending his hand. "Horticultural societies were our common ground, though I confess my specialty lies more with tropical specimens than orchids. Such a terrible business, her death. The village will be much poorer without her expertise." You were acquainted with Mrs. Hawksworth's work on orchid hybridization, I believe? Inquired Miss Marple, innocently. A flicker of something caution, perhaps, crossed Preston's face, only in the most general way. She was rather secretive, but her specific projects, understandably so given the commercial implications. Commercial implications? Echoed Miss Marple. Oh, you mean the patent rights? Yes, I believe the vicar mentioned something of the sort. Patents can be quite valuable in the horticultural world, said Preston, his gaze now directed toward the greenhouse. A successful hybrid can generate significant royalties. I understand Mrs. Hawksworth was planning to present something rather special at the upcoming society meeting. Before Miss Marple could respond, an irritable voice called from the direction of the house. I say, what's going on here? Constable, I thought I made it clear we weren't receiving visitors. Gerald Hawksworth strode across the lawn toward them, his expression thunderous. He was a man in his mid-30s, expensively if carelessly dressed, with features that might have been handsome were they not set in lines of perpetual discontent. Mr. Hawksworth, said Miss Marple, I do apologize for the intrusion. I merely wanted to leave some flowers in memory of your aunt. Mr. Preston and I were just discussing her remarkable contributions to horticulture. Gerald Hawksworth gave a dismissive gesture. Yes, yes, my aunt's precious plants. That's all anyone in this wretched village can talk about, as if a few flowers were worth the expense, and— He broke off abruptly, glancing at Preston. I wasn't aware you two were acquainted. We've just met, Preston explained smoothly. I came to pay my respects, as did Miss Marple. Your aunt was very well regarded in the horticultural community. So I've been told, repeatedly. Gerald's tone was terse. Well, I appreciate the sentiment, but we're rather occupied with funeral arrangements and legal matters, if you'll excuse me. Of course, murmured Miss Marple. Such a difficult time. I don't suppose you've had any word on your aunt's missing papers, the ones relating to her new hybrid? Gerald Hawksworth stared at her with undisguised surprise. How do you know about those? Village gossip, I'm afraid, said Miss Marple apologetically. One does hear things, and the police mentioned that some papers were missing when Mrs. Bantry and I called previously. The police should learn to be more discreet, said Gerald curtly. But no, the papers haven't been found. Not that they would mean anything to me. My aunt's obsession with her plants was frankly incomprehensible. If you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to. With a curt nod, he turned and strode back toward the house. Mr. Preston raised an eyebrow. Not a gardening enthusiast, it seems. No, agreed Miss Marple. I believe there was some friction regarding Mrs. Hawksworth's horticultural expenditures. Preston nodded. Common enough in families. One person's passion is another's folly. He glanced at his watch. I should be on my way. A pleasure meeting you, Miss Marple. Left alone, Miss Marple took the opportunity to wander a little further in the garden, ostensibly admiring the plantings, but keeping a watchful eye on the house. When she was certain no one was observing, she made her way closer to the greenhouse. The police tape prevented her from entering, but through the glass panels she could see the interior. The central workbench where Mrs. Hawksworth had presumably been found was now clear, but the surrounding shelves were still crowded with orchids in various stages of growth. Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to a shelf near the back, where several pots stood with labels but no plants, empty spaces in an otherwise crowded collection. On her way out, Miss Marple paused by a small table on the veranda where several gardening journals were stacked. The topmost one, she noticed, had several pages marked with slips of paper. Glancing toward the house and seeing no one, she quickly flipped to one of the marked pages. It was an article on recent developments in orchid breeding, with a paragraph heavily underlined. The registration of new orchid hybrids with the Royal Horticultural Society ensures legal protection of naming rights, while patent applications can secure commercial propagation rights for the developer. With rare orchid hybrids commanding prices upwards of £500 per specimen, the financial implications for successful hybridizers are significant. Miss Marple carefully replaced the journal and made her way to the gate, nodding politely to the constable as she left. Walking home, she considered what she had learned. Gerald Hawkesworth's apparent disdain for his aunt's horticultural pursuits contrasted sharply with Mr. Preston's informed interest. The missing plants from the greenhouse, the marked journal article, the valuable nature of orchid patents. These pieces were beginning to form a pattern that suggested the thefts on Larkspur Lane were indeed a deliberate distraction, orchestrated by someone who understood both the value of Hawkesworth's work and the mechanics of creating a convenient scapegoat. As she turned onto the high street, Miss Marple spotted a notice for the upcoming rare plant auction at the County Horticultural Society. Among the items listed was Selection of Specialty Orchids, Breeder's Collection. The date was just 5 days away. Miss Marple paused, her thoughtful gaze fixed on the notice. The pieces of the puzzle were connecting in her mind, forming a picture that was still incomplete, but increasingly clear. Someone had killed not just for a plant, but for the right to claim its creation. And in the botanical world, timing was everything. Chapter 6. Village Parallels. The following afternoon found Miss Marple in her garden room, entertaining Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock to tea. Outside, a light rain pattered against the windows, creating a cosy atmosphere within. Cherry had outdone herself with fresh scones, and the conversation had naturally turned to the events on Larkspur Lane. "I saw young Reggie Cobb this morning," remarked Dr. Haydock, helping himself to another scone. "His mother brought him in for a checkup. The boy looks quite worn down by his ordeal." "I'm not surprised," said Miss Marple, pouring more tea. "Being suspected of murder must be terribly distressing, especially for someone so young." "Well, he's not entirely innocent," Mrs. Bantry pointed out. "He did admit to all those peculiar thefts." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple, thoughtfully. "The thefts. They remind me rather of something that happened in the village many years ago. You might remember, Dolly, the summer when Mr. Beddoes was treasurer of the Church Restoration Fund." Mrs. Bantry frowned, trying to recall. "Beddoes! Wasn't there some trouble with the accounts?" "Indeed there was." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she continued to knit. Nearly £200 went missing over the course of 6 months, but what was particularly interesting was the series of small, rather theatrical incidents that occurred during the same period. Dr. Haydock looked intrigued. "What sort of incidents?" "Oh, various unusual thefts and pranks. Mrs. Elkins's cat was painted green. Judge Ponsonby's garden gnomes were rearranged in, well, rather improper positions." Miss Marple coughed delicately. "The hymn numbers at Sunday's service were replaced with racing results. Everyone assumed it was young Tommy Jenkins, who had a reputation for mischief." "And was it?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "Not at all. It was Edward Beddoes, the treasurer's son. He created these diversions to direct attention away from his systematic embezzlement of the restoration funds. By the time the truth came to light, he had disappeared to South America with the money." "You see a parallel with the current situation?" Dr. Haydock asked shrewdly. "One does wonder," said Miss Marple. "The nature of the thefts on Larkspur Lane, a sugar bowl and creamer but not the teapot, a brooch, garden ornaments, a cat with dyed fur. They seem designed to create confusion and establish a pattern of mischief rather than serious crime." "But surely Mrs. Hawkesworth's murder goes beyond mere diversion," objected Mrs. Bantry. "Oh yes," agreed Miss Marple. "The murder suggests something of much greater value was at stake." She set down her knitting and fixed her friends with a serious look. You recall that Mrs. Hawkesworth had developed a new orchid hybrid, one she intended to register and patent? Before either could respond, there was a knock at the door, and Cherry entered to announce Inspector Slack's arrival. The inspector looked, as usual, both efficient and irritable. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I understand you've been asking questions about Mrs. Hawkesworth's greenhouse." "I merely paid my respects and left some flowers from my garden," replied Miss Marple mildly. "Good afternoon, Inspector. Won't you have some tea?" Inspector Slack declined with a curt gesture. "I'm here on official business. It seems your theory about Reggie Cobb might have some merit. The boot print we found doesn't match his exactly. It's similar, but the heel pattern is different." "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "And have you had any luck locating Mrs. Hawkesworth's missing papers?" "The ones relating to her orchid hybrid?" The inspector's expression sharpened. "How do you know about those?" "When we visited after the murder, you mentioned that her orchid notes were missing," Miss Marple reminded him. "It seemed significant, especially given what I've since learned about the value of new orchid varieties." Inspector Slack frowned. "We're pursuing several lines of inquiry, but I'd appreciate it if you'd leave the investigating to the police, Miss Marple." After extracting a promise from Miss Marple to refrain from further visits to the Hawkesworth residence, Inspector Slack departed. Dr. Haydock, who had observed the exchange with interest, turned to Miss Marple. "You seem to have formed some definite ideas about this case, Jane. Care to share them?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving in a steady rhythm. "It's merely speculation at this point, but I believe Mrs. Hawkesworth's murder is connected to her work on orchid hybridization. The missing papers would presumably include her notes on the new variety and possibly the registration documents for the Royal Horticultural Society." "Registration documents?" queried Mrs. Bantry. "Yes. For a new plant variety to be officially recognized and therefore patentable, it must be properly registered. The timing is significant, I think. The County Horticultural Society is holding their rare plant auction this weekend." "You think someone killed Mrs. Hawkesworth to steal her orchid?" Mrs. Bantry looked sceptical. "Not just the plant itself, but the right to claim its development," corrected Miss Marple. "With the proper documentation, a new orchid hybrid could be quite valuable, especially if it has unusual characteristics or commercial potential." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "And I suppose, with Mrs. Hawkesworth gone, there would be no one to dispute such a claim." "Precisely." Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for a sheet of paper on the side table. "I've been considering who might have both the botanical knowledge and the opportunity. Mr. Preston is clearly knowledgeable about plants, though he claims his specialty is tropical specimens rather than orchids. Gerald Hawkesworth stood to inherit his aunt's estate, but seems to have little interest in horticulture." "What about the companion? Miss Brewster, wasn't it?" suggested Mrs. Bantry. "She lived in the house and would have had access to the greenhouse." "Yes, and there's also Hopkins, the gardener." Miss Marple paused. "I wonder, Dr. Haydock, if you might drive me to the County Horticultural Society tomorrow? I'd like to inquire about their registration procedures." Later that afternoon, after her guests had departed, Miss Marple walked to the village to attend the annual flower show at the church hall. As the rain had stopped, there was a good turnout of villagers eager to discuss the latest developments in the Hawkesworth case, while admiring the floral displays. Miss Marple paused by an exhibit of ornamental plants where she observed Mr. Preston examining a collection of exotic specimens. He moved methodically from plant to plant, occasionally making notes in a small book. His attention to detail was impressive, his knowledge evident in the precise way he inspected each specimen. At one point he looked up and caught Miss Marple watching him. With a courteous nod he approached her. "Miss Marple, Are you a competitor today?" "Oh, no," she replied with a self-deprecating smile. "My modest blooms couldn't possibly compete, but I do enjoy seeing the village's best efforts. You seem quite knowledgeable about plants, Mr. Preston." "A lifelong interest," he acknowledged, though Mrs. Hawksworth was the true expert. Such a tragedy to lose her, especially with her new hybrid so close to registration. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "You knew about her new hybrid?" A fleeting expression, caution perhaps, crossed Mr. Preston's face before he smiled. Only in general terms. She mentioned it at the last society meeting, quite excited about its potential, though characteristically secretive about the details. "If you'll excuse me, I should pay my respects to the vicar." As she watched him move away, Miss Marple's thoughtful gaze noted the precision of his movements, the careful way he handled the plants. The same kind of precision, perhaps, that would be required to cut a length of garden twine with clean, deliberate strokes, rather than in haste or panic. Chapter 7. The Pattern Emerges. The county library was nearly empty when Miss Marple arrived the following morning. She had dressed with particular care, wearing her best tweed suit and a hat that, while unfashionable, still conveyed a certain dignity. The librarian, Miss Price, looked up with mild surprise as Miss Marple approached the reference desk. "Good morning, Miss Marple. How unusual to see you here on a Thursday. Your garden club meets on Thursdays, does it not?" "Usually, yes," agreed Miss Marple. "But I've developed a particular interest in orchid cultivation, and I was hoping you might have some reference materials on the subject." Miss Price adjusted her spectacles. "Orchids?" "Yes, I believe we have Milligan's tropical orchids and their cultivation, and perhaps something on hybridization techniques. The botanical section is rather limited, I'm afraid." "Hybridization is precisely what interests me," said Miss Marple. "And perhaps something on plant patents and registration procedures, for new varieties, you understand." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple was seated at a corner table, surrounded by several slim volumes and a rather more substantial tome entitled Commercial Aspects of Botanical Innovation, Patents, Rights and Regulations. She read with careful attention, occasionally making notes in a small notebook she had brought for the purpose. "Most illuminating," she murmured to herself as she consulted a chapter on registration requirements. The Royal Horticultural Society's process was quite specific: detailed documentation of the hybridization process, photographic evidence, and verification by established experts. Most interesting of all was the provision that the first person to register a new variety secured the naming rights and potential patent benefits, even if others had been working on similar hybrids. By noon, Miss Marple had filled several pages with notes. She thanked Miss Price and made her way to the village tea shop, where she had arranged to meet Dr. Haydock. "Research going well?" he inquired, after they had ordered tea. "Very informative, thank you." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. "I wonder, might you be able to drive me to the County Horticultural Society this afternoon? It's in Danebridge, I believe." Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "Playing detective again, Jane? Inspector Slack won't be pleased." "Oh, I'm merely satisfying my curiosity about gardening matters," Miss Marple replied innocently. "And perhaps learning a little about orchid registration procedures." Dr. Haydock's car was old but well-maintained, and the drive to Danebridge passed pleasantly. The County Horticultural Society occupied a handsome Georgian building with extensive gardens at the rear. A sign at the entrance announced the upcoming rare plant auction, now just 3 days away. The receptionist, a brisk woman in her 40s, looked up as they entered. "May I help you?" "I do hope so," said Miss Marple, with her most benign smile. "I'm interested in the procedure for registering a new plant variety. My late friend Mrs. Hawkesworth often spoke of the process, but I'm afraid I never properly understood it." At the mention of Mrs. Hawkesworth, the receptionist's expression softened. "Oh yes, poor Mrs. Hawkesworth, such a tragedy. She was one of our most respected members." "Was she planning to register a new variety soon?" inquired Miss Marple. "She had mentioned a new orchid hybrid at our last monthly meeting. Quite excited about it, though characteristically secretive about the details. She was due to present it next week." The receptionist hesitated. "I suppose I shouldn't be gossiping about members, but there was quite a stir when she hinted that her new hybrid might revolutionize commercial orchid breeding." "Indeed. How fascinating." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And would her documentation have been submitted already?" "Oh no, that would happen at the official presentation. The registration committee reviews the documentation, examines the specimen, and if everything is in order, initiates the application to the Royal Horticultural Society." The receptionist lowered her voice. "Between ourselves, there was some competition in that area. Mr. Preston, another of our members, has also been working on orchid hybrids. There was a bit of tension at the last meeting when Mrs. Hawkesworth mentioned her breakthrough. After gathering a few more details about the registration process, Miss Marple thanked the receptionist and rejoined Dr. Haydock, who had been examining displays of prize-winning plants in the lobby. "Learn anything useful?" he asked, as they walked back to the car. "I believe so," replied Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Most enlightening." Upon their return to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found that Mrs. Bantry had left a message asking her to call urgently. When she telephoned, Mrs. Bantry was bubbling with news. "Jane, the most extraordinary development. Ellen, Mrs. Hawkesworth's housekeeper, came to see me this afternoon. She found a garden plan tucked inside one of Mrs. Hawkesworth's horticultural journals and thought it might be important. Inspector Slack had already finished with the house, so she brought it to me." "A garden plan?" Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Of the greenhouse, perhaps?" "Exactly. It shows the precise location of each orchid, with notations and codes that Ellen couldn't decipher. I told her you might be able to make sense of it. She's left it with me if you'd like to see it." "I would indeed. Might I come over tomorrow morning?" "Better yet, I'll bring it to you. I'm planning to call on the vicar's wife at 11, so I could stop by on my way." After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple sat for a moment in thought. Then she went to her desk and began to write several notes. One was to Inspector Slack, requesting his presence at her cottage the following afternoon on a matter pertaining to Mrs. Hawkesworth's murder. Another was to Dr. Haydock, asking him to attend as well. The third was addressed to Mr. Preston, inviting him to tea to discuss matters of mutual horticultural interest. "Cherry," she called, when she had sealed the envelopes, "would you be kind enough to deliver these notes when you go out?" That evening, as twilight softened the garden, Miss Marple received word that valuable orchid specimens had been removed from Mrs. Hawkesworth's greenhouse. The news came via Cherry, who had heard it from her young man, who worked at the police station. "They're saying some of Mrs. Hawkesworth's rarest orchids have vanished," reported Cherry. "Taken right from under the police's noses, even with the greenhouse being off limits. Inspector Slack is in a terrible state." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple, her knitting needles moving steadily. "And when was this discovery made?" "Just this afternoon, miss, when they were doing a final inventory of the greenhouse before releasing the scene." After Cherry had gone, Miss Marple went to her telephone and made a call to London. The conversation was brief but appeared to satisfy her, for when she hung up, there was a small, triumphant smile on her face. "Yes," she said to herself, "it all fits together quite neatly now." She returned to her armchair and her knitting, but her mind was busy arranging the facts like pieces in a complex puzzle, the peculiar thefts designed to establish Reggie Cobb as the village miscreant, The precise cutting of the garden twine, Mrs. Hawkesworth's missing orchid notes, the tension between her and Mr. Preston over hybridization, and now the disappearance of rare specimens from the greenhouse. The pattern was clear to her now, and with it, the identity of the killer. Chapter 8. Truth in Bloom. Miss Marple's cottage presented a picture of genteel hospitality as afternoon sunlight filtered through the curtains of her drawing-room. Cherry had outdone herself with an impressive array of sandwiches, scones and cakes arranged on the best china. Miss Marple herself, neat in her second-best grey dress with a cameo brooch at her throat, was the image of an elderly spinster preparing to entertain guests. "Everything looks lovely, Cherry," she said, adjusting a vase of freshly cut roses. "Do show everyone in as they arrive." The first to appear was Dolly Bantry, carrying a folded paper that Miss Marple recognized as Mrs. Hawkesworth's garden plan. "Jane, I do hope you know what you're doing," Mrs. Bantry said in a hushed voice. "Inspector Slack sounded most put out on the telephone when I spoke to him." "I'm sure he was," replied Miss Marple, serenely. "But I think he'll find this afternoon quite illuminating." Dr. Haydock arrived next, followed by the vicar, who seemed rather bewildered by his inclusion. Gerald Hawkesworth appeared precisely at the appointed time, his expression suggesting he had better things to do. Inspector Slack arrived looking irritable, accompanied by a uniformed constable who stationed himself discreetly by the door. "I trust this isn't a waste of police time, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack began, declining the offer of tea. "We're rather occupied with a murder investigation." "So are we all, Inspector," replied Miss Marple, mildly. "Ah, here is our final guest." Mr. Preston entered, pausing momentarily at the sight of the assembled company before nodding politely. "Miss Marple, this is rather more than the horticultural discussion I was expecting." "Do sit down, Mr. Preston. Tea?" Miss Marple presided over the teapot with calm efficiency. "I thought it might be helpful to discuss certain aspects of Mrs. Hawkesworth's death that have perhaps been overlooked." "I wasn't aware you were conducting a parallel investigation, Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack with barely concealed irritation. "Oh, not an investigation as such, Inspector. Merely observations, drawing on certain parallels from village life." Miss Marple poured tea with a steady hand. "For instance, the curious series of thefts on Larkspur Lane reminded me strongly of something that happened in the village many years ago when a bank clerk created diversions to cover his embezzlement." Gerald Hawkesworth shifted impatiently. "I fail to see what this has to do with my aunt's murder." "Everything, I believe," said Miss Marple. "The thefts were deliberate distractions designed to establish Reggie Cobb as the local miscreant, a convenient scapegoat for a more serious crime." "We've established that Cobb wasn't responsible for the murder," interrupted Inspector Slack. "His boot print didn't match exactly." "No, indeed," Miss Marple nodded. "The killer would have planted that evidence, just as they orchestrated the thefts to appear as random mischief. But there was nothing random about Mrs. Hawkesworth's murder. It was carefully planned by someone who understood the value of what they were stealing, not silver or brooches, but something far more precious." "The orchid hybrid," said Dr. Haydock quietly. "Precisely." Miss Marple set down her teacup. Mrs. Hawkesworth had developed a valuable new orchid variety, one she intended to register and patent. The commercial implications were significant, as I learned during my research at the County Horticultural Society. "You've been interfering in police business," Inspector Slack began, but Miss Marple continued undeterred. "The killer needed both the documentation proving Mrs. Hawkesworth's development of the hybrid and the plants themselves. With Mrs. Hawkesworth gone and the paperwork in their possession, they could register the hybrid as their own creation at the upcoming society meeting." She turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, might I see that garden plan?" Taking the paper, she studied it for a moment before passing it to Inspector Slack. "You'll notice the coded entries for certain plants in positions 7 through 10 on the third shelf. Those correspond to the missing orchids reported yesterday." Gerald Hawksworth leaned forward. "Are you suggesting someone murdered my aunt for a plant?" "For the rights to a potentially valuable commercial hybrid," corrected Miss Marple. "The registration and patent could be worth thousands of pounds over time." Mr. Preston cleared his throat. "A fascinating theory, Miss Marple, but purely speculative, surely." "Not entirely," said Miss Marple. "You see, I made a telephone call yesterday to the Royal Horticultural Society in London. They confirmed that Mrs. Hawksworth had submitted preliminary documentation for a new orchid hybrid last month, a precautionary measure, they said, though the formal registration was to occur after her presentation next week." A subtle change came over Mr. Preston's face, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in his posture. "Furthermore," continued Miss Marple, "I believe Mrs. Hawksworth discovered that someone had been examining her greenhouse without permission. Perhaps she caught them making notes about her hybrid, notes they intended to use to claim the discovery as their own. This led to a confrontation and ultimately to murder." "And who is this phantom orchid thief?" demanded Gerald Hawksworth sceptically. Miss Marple turned to Inspector Slack. "The evidence is quite clear, I think. The garden twine used to strangle Mrs. Hawksworth was cut with precise, deliberate strokes, the work of someone familiar with gardening tools, not a panicked youth like Reggie Cobb. Mrs. Hawksworth's glasses were found placed on a potting bench, suggesting she had been working when interrupted. And most tellingly, certain rare orchid specimens have now vanished from the greenhouse. Specimens that match the coded entries in her garden plan." She looked directly at Mr. Preston. "It reminds me rather of Miss Hartnell's seamstress, who once attempted to claim another dressmaker's design as her own. When confronted, she too resorted to desperate measures." "This is absurd," said Mr. Preston, though his voice lacked conviction. "I hardly knew Mrs. Hawksworth." "On the contrary," replied Miss Marple, "you were both members of the same horticultural society. You both specialized in rare plant varieties, and according to the society's receptionist, there was tension between you at the last meeting when Mrs. Hawksworth mentioned her breakthrough." "Circumstantial," muttered Preston, but his face had grown pale. "Perhaps," agreed Miss Marple, "but I believe a search of Mr. Preston's cottage would reveal both the missing orchid specimens and Mrs. Hawksworth's hybridization notes, and possibly even a pair of boots matching the print found by the greenhouse, boots purchased, I suspect, to match Reggie Cobb's distinctive footwear." A tense silence fell over the room. Then with startling suddenness Mr. Preston rose to his feet, only to find his way blocked by the constable at the door. "You have no proof," he said, his composure finally cracking. "None whatsoever." "The orchids will be proof enough," said Inspector Slack, who had been listening with growing interest. "And I'd venture we'll find traces of soil from Mrs. Hawksworth's greenhouse on your shoes or clothing. Murder leaves its traces, Mr. Preston." Later that evening, after Inspector Slack had taken Mr. Preston away and the other guests had departed, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden. The roses needed deadheading, she noted absently, and the delphiniums would require staking after the recent rain. Her thoughts returned to Mrs. Hawksworth and her fatal passion for orchids. How strange that beauty could inspire such darkness, that the creation of something lovely could lead to such ugliness of spirit. But then, as Miss Marple had observed many times over her long life in St. Mary Mead, human nature remained constant whether in great cities or small villages. Greed, jealousy, and the desire for recognition could flourish anywhere, even among the refined atmosphere of horticultural societies. The Larkspur Lane larcenies, she murmured to herself with a small, sad smile. A theatrical series of diversions that had nearly succeeded in their purpose. Had Mr. Preston not been so precise in his methods, had he torn the garden twine rather than cutting it cleanly, he might well have escaped detection. As twilight deepened over her beloved garden, Miss Marple reflected that despite all she had seen of human frailty, there remained much to cherish in the world: friendship, kindness, and the simple beauty of flowers blooming exactly as nature intended. Thanks for joining us for today's mystery. Did you suspect Mr. Preston before Miss Marple revealed how he orchestrated the thefts to frame young Reggie Cobb? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this adventure with Miss Marple, don't forget to hit subscribe for more mysteries daily. Until next time, remember Miss Marple's wisdom. Human nature is much the same everywhere, and the most carefully planned crimes often unravel through the smallest details, like the precise cutting of a simple piece of garden twine. This is Alfie, signing off from Café Stories.